Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. This is Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi, one of the fellows here at Yaqeen Institute. This is going to be my first Q&A, a live Q&A session for my paper, The Structure of Scientific Productivity in Islamic Civilization, Orientalist Fables, which is actually part one of the overall project. Let's see here. Prior to answering any questions, I will be just sort of giving a brief regarding why I wrote this paper and, summarizing the topic. Essentially, the reason that I wanted to write about the history of scientific productivity in Islamic civilization and the current state of it is, first off, because I'm interested in the subject matter. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, Abdul Hakim. How are you? Um, and I'm interested in the subject matter, and I've always been interested in figuring out why the Muslim world is in the current state that it's in. Um, and it was sort of like a big mystery for me. So one of the things that um, that I've always wanted to know about, especially since becoming Muslim, was why we are now in the current state that we're in, and how we can go back to being productive like we once were during the Golden Age. So that was the purpose behind this paper, and I guess the subject itself, it's fairly broad. It's a very large subject because I have to delve into so many different things, so many details. I have to also look at the contemporary research on the subject matter and also previous research on the subject matter to see where people have gone right and where people have gone wrong. So, in order to to ascertain what really happened, because honestly, there isn't really much regarding the decline itself. We know a lot more about how Islamic civilization reached the Golden Age, but we really still don't know what happened with the decline. So what I'm trying to figure out is really what is the answer to that? What is the real answer to that? Some people have given hypotheses and things like this, but nothing really concrete, nothing really solid. Um, so I thought that with my own background in philosophy and history, that maybe I could take a crack at it, and inshallah, I do hope that I have stumbled upon the answer. In the first part of the paper, the one that I'm discussing right now, I had to kind of go through all the previous research and all the contemporary research on the subject prior to giving my own answers. So that's why, for those of you who read to the end of the paper, and I hope you didn't really see the answer to how the decline occurred, because, like I said, this is just the first part. I'm just trying to set the stage so that when I do offer my main arguments, then you'll kind of understand the background and where it's coming from. Okay, so let's jump into questions real quick here, because if I keep talking, I'll use up all my 30 minutes. Let's see. Abdul Hakim, question. When Muslims talk about their scientific history, do you feel that it's too general and not specific? We are not told, for example, details about how Ibn al-Haytham had pre-Newtonian ideas of calculus or how Copernicus utilized Arabic mathematics. In other words, in our presentation of history, too abstract and not made relevant enough to the modern world. That's a pretty large question. Generally speaking, actually, the perception of science among the lay population, generally speaking, is wrong anyway. It tends to veer off into a very positivistic, what I mean to say is a very absolutist understanding of what science is. So when we talk about, for instance, like you just said, Ibn al-Haytham's pre-Newtonian ideas of calculus, um, honestly, that's sort of an improper rendering of what he thought, because we're looking at it very anachronistically, meaning that we're looking at it from our present situation and trying to judge how he viewed the situation or how he viewed that field or in mathematics in general, from our understanding of things. And this is problematic because, as I note in the paper itself, he was operating from a completely different paradigm. Whereas today, we understand calculus, we understand mathematics even in a very different way. To give you sort of a brief of what I mean by that, in the Platonist theories of mathematics, even Aristotelian mathematics, math or numbers themselves were actual things, like they were objects, like they were things that were floating around somewhere in some alternate universe. Today we have a more analytical understanding of mathematics as being symbolic, just numbers of symbols. They're unfortunately, um, when we look back in history, we tend to describe it in such a way, in accordance with sort of our contemporary understanding. And this is why we misunderstand how people thought in the past. And this is also why we misunderstand how Muslims practice the sciences and develop the sciences in the past. And we miscalculate then how to get back to that time period. There's a lot of issues here in regards to your question, but a lot of assumptions are made from this time period to the history itself, and that was something that I was trying to deal with in the paper as well. Next question: could you give a brief outline of how you began your research and proceed with it? How I began my research. Okay. By the way, everyone, it's actually quite late here. I'm actually doing a live session from Malaysia, so it's about like 12 a.m. in the morning. So if I sound a little incoherent, I apologize. But okay, I began my research about a year ago, more than a year ago, actually. I did a preliminary paper on the subject, and it was a fairly small paper, maybe like 15 pages or so, just sort of looking into the issue. And I did a lot of reading with sort of the popular understanding of it and the alternative understandings that have been offered in the past few years. And I just kept reading and reading and reading. Actually, most of my research is done reading. Writing is like the least of my concern. But yeah, I mostly just read. And after I released my preliminary paper, I kind of left it alone for a little while. I had planned to write something more exhaustive in the future, but I never got around to it until very recently. I had a paper in the works, but then I kind of stopped writing, and then finally, when I became part of the Yaqeen Institute, I finally finished the paper, and I've even made it bigger than what it originally was. So, yeah, let's see. Well, there's a lot of comments here, Abdul Hakim. I don't know if I can keep up, my friend. By the way, everyone, if I don't get to your questions, feel free to leave them anyway, and I will answer after the session, meaning that I'll answer the comments myself. So don't worry, I won't miss you regardless. Let's see. Okay, could you in the future consider writing a piece on the reception of the heliocentric theory in the Islamic world via individuals like Ibrahim Haki, and how it was positively taken by the ulama of the time? I get the feeling that people get confused from reading about Galileo and misunderstanding some hadith, thus they need some clarification. Once again, your questions are quite complex, Abdul Hakim. Yes, I could write about something like that in the future, although my main concern right now is finishing this project, obviously getting to part 2, and hopefully finishing it off. But inshallah, maybe in the future. It really depends on what I think is pertinent at the time. Any more questions? I know it was a very long paper, guys. It was like 43 pages or something in the PDF, maybe longer than that. I have to be honest with you. I write a lot, and the reason I do is because I feel like I have to touch all the bases. I mean, I feel like I'm doing a disservice to my readers if I don't. If I just give you a brief, if I just give you, a summary. For me, I have to touch every single aspect of the topic in order to really help you guys understand. And I apologize in advance. I know in this day and age, reading a lot is not really something people like to do. But I really believe in the intelligence of my readers and the audience. I really believe in the fact that you guys are interested in these things. And that's why I don't let that limit me. So I don't let, the length of something limit me. So I really hope that you guys really took the time to read it and to look over it. And yeah. Let's see. Yusuf Ali, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you? Asadullah, how do you best recommend Muslims get into things like philosophy writing to further help intellectual dawah? Well, it's not really relevant to the, well, it's kind of relevant to the topic, but briefly, I'll just say that first off, we need to stop being scared of subjects outside of Islam. I mean, one of the reasons personally that I feel that, for instance, the topic that I have to discuss, that this paper I had to write, the reason I had to write it is because Muslims are very much not interested in these subjects, and that's why we have not made any adequate answers to Orientalists and Islamophobes when it comes to, them suggesting that Islam has something to do with anti-science or has something to do with the fall of civilization, et cetera, et cetera. And if Muslims were more interested in history and philosophy and things like this, this wouldn't be much of a concern. Um, yes, the topic here is regarding my recent paper. So let's see. Any other questions? I'm going to be drinking my tea in the meantime. Yes, it's green tea. It's not very flavorful, but it keeps me awake somewhat. So before any other questions come in, sorry guys. That was not intentional. So let me get into the, sorry, let me get into the subject of the paper a little bit more. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so in regards to many of the subsections in the paper, I know it's a very long paper. I thought that it would be best to first start off with the sort of the definitions, sort of trying to define science away from the contemporary mythology surrounding it as not this sort of absolute thing, that we use to understand the world, rather as a form of theory construction, as a form of being able to comprehend uh, the physical realm. Um, so when theories are constructed, they're not constructed in such a way that we look at the world and then we just put everything together and then it just magically pops in our head and there we have a theory. No, actually we form the theories prior in order to coherently understand what's going on, scientifically speaking. So uh, that's something I had to first get into because there is a perception in the world today, that a popular perception, that science is this very absolute idea or this absolute practice of reality, that everything that science suggests is in fact what the world is. And that's a very dangerous idea, and that's one of the reasons I think that is causing a lot of confusion today, especially in regards to scientific history, is because we have this perception that somehow, oh yeah, back then every people didn't know anything. They didn't know anything at all. Only today, only in the past 100 years, do we know anything about the physical world, and that's simply not true. Um, we have a very different perception, probably a more complex and more coherent perception of the world. But it's not as though people in the past didn't know anything. Like for instance, there's a huge myth now floating around since probably the beginning of the 20th century that everyone in the past believed the Earth was flat, and that's nonsense because the majority, probably 99% of the world population, for millenniums, like just thousands of years, have believed that the Earth was round. Uh, Actually, the common perception of the Earth was that it was stationary, meaning it didn't move, because they believed the Ptolemaic system. They believed that all the planets rotated around the Earth, not the other way around. The Ptolemaic system. That was the main conception, but everyone basically believed the Earth was round. And the reason they did is because, well, they look at the sky and they see all the other planets are round, and they stand on a high point in the Earth and they can see the curvature of the Earth. It's very obvious. So this whole idea that the Earth was flat prior, that's nonsense. Um, but what has happened over time is that our theories have become more complex, better able to accommodate new information, et cetera, et cetera. But there is no absolutist understanding of science. Even today, our theories are generally flawed. I mean, they're the best thing that we have, the best way of understanding the world, but they're flawed. I mean, there's a lot of stuff probably missing there because we're humans, we're limited in our understanding of things. We have to really do a lot of guesswork. So that's not a bad thing at all. I mean, if you have an absolutist understanding of science, let me put it this way. If you have an absolutist understanding of science, then that actually is more a problem for science than anything else. Think about it. If we said, or people in the past said, oh, everything rotates around the Earth, and they said, no, that's how science, that's the reality. Science can't change there. Then we would have never adopted the heliocentric theory, right? There had to be people who were skeptical, people who were open to a different understanding in order for that to occur. So even today, I caution a lot of people when they say, "Oh, the science says this." Yes, science says this now, but maybe in the future it may say something a little different, something that makes us look ignorant now. So be very cautious about when you say science says something, because that's not the case, really. It's very temporal. It's based on the theory that we've constructed in order to coherently understand the data. And the next section, I delved into the popular conception of Islamic scientific history called the classical narrative, promulgated by Orientalists, which suggests that basically Islam had everything to do with the decline and nothing to do with the rise of science. So only anti-religious elements, were facilitating science. And this is a very popular narrative for some time, and only in the past maybe 10, 20 years has been really challenged to a great deal. And the reason why is because, first off, it just doesn't coherently represent the data that we have on hand. And secondly, there's a lot of assumptions being made in regards to history on the basis of, once again, an anachronistic view, or not anachronistic, but more of a Eurocentric view of history. So, for instance, many Europeans and Americans will write about Islamic history, and they will interpret Islamic history on the same way that they interpret European history with the church, which is a little bit different from how Islam dealt with science. And they do this, I think, without really knowing it. I think that they just sort of assume that religion has always been sort of antagonistic to science, and then they sort of and by the way, the whole church versus science thing is also not entirely accurate, um, but that's a different discussion altogether. But yeah, they take this assumptions and then they put it onto Islamic history, and then they assume they got everything correct. But then when you look at all the details, when you look at actually how everything kind of developed, it's not even close. What you find is that even though orthodoxy, or the established doctrines throughout time, did limit people's understanding of scientific subjects, it did so in a way that was very positive. So as I point out in the paper, Aristotelian philosophy was sort of dominant in the early Islamic period. And as it was being challenged, is actually as it was being challenged is when Muslims started to develop the sciences further, more advanced, and to promulgate new ideas. Because Aristotelian natural philosophy was not entirely accurate. It's actually not entirely accurate at all. Um, okay, another question. Sorry, I've been talking a lot. Yusuf Ali, how long does it take you to produce a paper, including reading, drafting, proofreading, etc.? Oh my gosh, that's a very good question. Several months. This paper in particular, the one that I just wrote, and its sister coming out soon, took me about a year. I'm being very honest, a year. I mean, most of the time was writing. I'm sorry, most of the time was reading. The other time was writing and then revising. Proofreading, that takes like a week, at most. But and then the peer review process takes maybe a couple of weeks too. But most of the time is spent reading, reading, and reading, and reading, and reading, and reading, and reading, and writing. So when I wrote this paper, I feel kind of bad saying this. I don't have much mercy on my readers because I wrote 43 pages, right? But think about how much I had to read in order to write that paper. Like I literally probably read 2 or 3, maybe even 4,000 pages of work, academic papers and books, maybe even more than that. I can't even register how much I read. So when I write when I summarize all that and make my own arguments in only 43 pages, I don't have much sympathy for you guys. No offense, you know. But uh, seriously though, yeah, it takes a long time. Um, and but it's worth it for me. The things that I learned in the process, having to analyze all those things, it's actually very enjoyable for me. Maybe it's a little dry for you guys, but it's something that I love to do. So, any questions about the paper itself? Anything you guys need clarification on? We got about 10 minutes left. You can always leave your questions down below, but I feel like I'm just ranting the whole time. Not very entertaining unless you want me to do jokes, but that's probably not appropriate for this broadcast. Thank you very much. I just hope everyone read the paper. Like I said, we have a problem in this day and age. People don't like to want to read very much, and I don't think it's because they can't or because they have a low attention span. I don't buy those explanations because if you actually look at the way people use social media, people are on social media for hours. So you're telling me you can go on Facebook for 2 or 3 hours a day, but you can't read a paper? No, it's people's interest that really is the problem. You know, I think if you guys really just took the time, or the readers really took the time to just read and try to focus, they would it'd be easy for them. But it's based on people's desire to do so. It's not it's not because they're incapable. You Nazmul Hassan, Assalamu alaikum. Why did the Muslim world never develop empiricist science? Well, actually, no. There were a lot of empiricists. A lot. Al-Ghazali was one of them. He was probably the well-known empiricist. You have to understand something. Aristotelian philosophers, or the Muslim philosophers who followed Aristotle, were more idealist, were more rationalist than they were empiricist. They were very abstract in their thinking. They focused more on logic and other things. Aristotle, of course, is more empirical than Plato was, but I mean, for the most part, Muslims were empiricist more as they rejected Aristotle, and in fact, that speaks volumes also for the European world. I mean, the European Renaissance, the Enlightenment itself, was a result of rejecting Aristotle and developing a empiricist approach. But they had to reject Aristotle first. So, I would say yes, the Muslims did develop an empiricism. If you read the paper itself, you'll find several examples of that as well, especially with Al-Kushti, one of the better known examples, and Ibn al-Haytham and others. Um, so, yeah, I would say that there were many empiricists. Muslims were probably the first major empiricists in history. Um, but we lost that empirical tradition around the 16th, 17th century, which I'll get into more detail later in the second part. But yeah, Al-Ghazali was one notable example of being an empiricist. The empiricism, you ask another question, Ismail. Did the empiricism affect the views on theology and other areas in religion? Actually, in fact, most of the empiricism that occurred as a result, as I said, of rejecting Aristotle. And the reason they rejected Aristotle is because they had to work around the orthodox opinions of their time. So, the Ash'ari theologians, for instance, had stated very clearly and very openly that certain aspects of Aristotelian philosophy were plain wrong or heretical. Many of the scientists had to say, okay, well, since we can't use this paradigm anymore, we can't use this philosophy anymore, we have to come up with our own stuff. And that's really when they started to really become empiricist. So, in fact, theology helped to limit a lot of the abstract notions that were holding them back from being empiricist. Um, because when you say, look, you can't adopt this philosophy anymore, now you have to come up with something else, then that forces people to think, and to have to develop their own models. Muhammad Abdullah An-Numan, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. How are you? Brother, what do you think about the interaction between Islam, Quran, and Hadith, to be more specific, and science? What do you mean? Could you be more specific? Hamza Mahmood. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What's your response to Islamic da'is like Zakir Naik who use science to prove Islam? I think that is the wrong approach to take. I'm sorry to be very blunt here, but especially if you read the history of how Muslims thought about science, you would be least likely to use this methodology or to consider it to be valid. And I'm not going to go into too many details as to why, though I will say this, that one of the reasons that the Muslim world declined in scientific productivity was because they started to adopt this idea. They started to adopt this idea that science could be used as a means to measure revelation, to measure the truth of revelation. What we call, and really it started to develop within the tafsir tradition earlier than the contemporary period, actually around the 12th century or so, but it was a minority position back then. It only became the majority around 17th, 18th century, maybe more than that. But yeah, it is one of the reasons that we are now in the state that we are in, is because we have this absolutist understanding of science. That is really what curbed our development in the sciences. So when you combine science and revelation, when you say that scientific discoveries are on the same level as revelation, that is a huge problem, because now you're saying, well, there's nowhere else to go now in science. We have all the answers, right? So why do we need to develop the sciences further? Why do we need to learn anything? Because we know everything. It's all in the Quran and the Hadith, right? See, that's a big problem. The early Muslim community did not think that way. They demarcated between scientific enterprise and the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay, and they took inspiration from the Quran and the Sunnah, but they didn't say that science was there and inside of it, that you could derive scientific facts from it, or that you could use scientific discoveries to prove it. That was never the case. Only very recently has that become an exegetical method, and or at least a popular one, and it has largely to do with, what I mean to say is that, like I said, it wasn't as popular in the past, but it gradually became more popular. And you see that as it becomes more popular, Muslims begin to be less scientifically productive. So there's a very strong correlation there. So I don't agree with it. I don't think it's a good method. I don't think it's a method that we even need, or that can be even used in a positive way. In fact, it's very detrimental to presenting Islam to others, or even to believing in Islam. Look, let me put it this way: if the early Muslim community, for over 1,000 years prior to the last few centuries, didn't need science to prove the Quran or the Sunnah, why do we? You know, and when has this ever been? And when has taking from the dunya to measure revelation ever been a valid thing? That's something to consider. All right, we have about 2 minutes left, guys. So please throw out any other questions you need to throw out. Like I said, even if you don't get to post your question in the live session, please do so outside, and just leave a comment, and I will respond to it when I have the time, which will be very soon. So don't worry. Muhammad Abdullah An-Numan, assalamu alaikum again. Oh, more questions. Like, some people like to explain everything under the light of Islam, and others say both are totally different things, have no connection between them. There are some things that have to do with natural science, like creation of Adam, and others don't. Well, yeah, look, I'm not saying that you completely demarcate between them in such a way that there's no relevance whatsoever. Like, for instance, I mean, obviously the Quran and the Sunnah do talk about scientific subjects. They don't give any specifics to it, though. I mean, like, they try to inspire us to go out and learn about the natural world. And, our understanding of science can help us to enrich certain things that we understand about history, and about why certain things were positive or negative in Islamic history today, there is always going to be some relationship between every field of study, no matter no matter how far apart they appear to be. What I'm trying to say is that you don't conflate them to such an extent that they become equal. Um, Nazmul Hassan, to what extent do you think liberal democracy played a role in the scientific progress of the Western world, or do you think much of the progress relates to gaining our spoils from colonialism? Well, the Occident's scientific enterprise actually came as a result. First off, it really started to begin to blossom, or it got really firmly established when they discovered the New World, meaning the Americas. That's when they got a huge. They started to bring in a lot more new resources. They didn't have to go through the Muslim world anymore in order to trade and et cetera, et cetera. So they became more independent that way. To be honest, democracy had very little to do with anything. Um, I mean, it did, but not to the extent that it's promoted today as this all-encompassing um, theory for progress and virtue and everything else. Most of it was, I mean, if you want to talk about ideology, the principal ideology was simply anti-Aristotelian, opposing sort of their own older paradigms, um, and trying to find ways in order to survive. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention, right? So European society, European culture were really on a downslope as Muslims ruled the world. Um, but when they discovered the New World, the Americas, then they had a way out, and that's when they really started to develop their own interest, their own means towards towards their civilization, towards progressing their civilization. And as I mentioned in the paper, the values of a society are really what determine the path, the direction a science goes. So scientists within the European world developed the things that they did in accordance with the needs and desires of the society that they lived in. So, for instance, they started developing more weapons and technology to fight against rival empires, i.e., the Muslim Empire, our empire, um, and they started developing other means by which to to survive and to succeed, the same way that the Muslim world did in its during its advent as well. So, okay, it is a little bit late now. It's going over time here, so I'm going to close off, guys. You can just leave your questions below in the comments section, and I will answer them later. But I really appreciate you guys listening to me ramble. And yeah, hopefully the next paper will be coming out probably the next month or two, inshallah. So we'll see. So thank you guys again, and hopefully you guys, for those of you who haven't read the full article, please do, and please share the article with others. And yeah, that's it. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.